Greetings. My name is Ken Bailey. I'm an adult in my mid-50s, but as a boy I grew up in a little town in the west called Rangeley, Colorado, site of one of the country's major oil fields. Rangeley was an interesting community. Although oil had been developed there on a very small scale almost a century ago, it wasn't until the 1930s that they drilled far deeper than they had before and found an enormous Weber Sands soaked pool that became the Rangeley Weber Sand Unit oil field. Originally, the field was drilled out during the World War II years, and back then, here's a map of the entire field. As you can see, the oil wells were drilled out in nice straight rows. They were drilled on what was called 40-acre spacing to conserve oil. That is, from every single oil well diagonally to the next oil well in what looked like a checkerboard, it was about 40 acres. During the years I lived there, in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, they were doing what was called offset drilling or infill drilling on 20 acres. That is, if you were to take 4 oil wells, making a square, you sunk a 5th one right in the middle to an area where the other 4 might not be able to reach real well. And then you had like the 5 spot on a dice. That 5th well was called an infill well. I had a friend and a high school teacher named Bill Mitchum who got me interested in photography back in those days. And it was Bill that took this picture. I love the Rangeley oil field. I was especially fascinated by the many types of oil pumpers and other equipment. Took hundreds of pictures, and I'd like to share some of them with you on this album. Firstly, this is not a picture I took, but one that was given to me. That's largely what Rangeley looked like back in the 1960s. The road going through on the right is Highway 64, which for 1 mile became Main Street. This is the Discovery Well, Raven A1, and that's yours truly standing in front of it. Raven was still worked in those days by what was commonly called a Lufkin 64 conventional oil pump. The 64 means that it pulled the polished rod up and down out of the well about 64 inches for each stroke. There were also shallow wells in the Rangeley area scattered throughout the deep field. This is a pumper, a little Bethlehem pumper we called Old Ironsides. It used to be out behind the hospital. One night, on a very cold, frigid January night, Old Ironsides was working and broke the pin on what's called a pitman arm, the thing that pushes the walking beam up and down. And because nobody told it to stop, it being a machine just kept trying to pump oil and literally twisted itself up like an old washcloth. This is the way it looked several days later. Old Ironsides then was put out to pasture, and I have one of the nameplates off this old pump in my collection to this very day. Here's another picture of the Lufkin 64 on the Raven well. This was the first well of the Rangeley Deep Field. The wells are about a mile deep. Bill Mitchum took this picture. The Rangeley field was about roughly 10 miles long by 5 miles wide. It was in a huge basin, and on the west end of the basin, the town was on the east end, was an enormous, beautiful mountain called Melon Hill. At one time, the big oil pumps actually went right up the side of Melon Hill, as Bill is recorded in this picture taken about 1960. And on top of the hill was a TV tower. 10 miles distant in the town, when you bought a TV, you bought a TV aerial or antenna, you climbed up on your roof and you pointed it to this distant peak. The TV came from Salt Lake City, about 300 miles away. That was long before cable and some of the other blessings we have today. This picture I took, here we have a great big Lufkin air balance pump, so-called because this big tube right behind what's called the horse's head worked a little like the tube on your screen door that keeps it from slamming. As the the pump came down, it compressed air, and the compressed air helped force it back up again as the pitman arms, those arms behind it, pushed the walking beam up and down. The Rangeley field during this time was being converted from these rod pumps to underground electric pumps called submersibles. Where there'd be very little to see on the surface, they would take the rod pump away, and all that was left was a control box, which at that time was fastened to a telephone pole. In fact, this big machine oil pump here probably is doomed, because if we look carefully in the background, we can already see a submersible control box on a telephone pole in the distance. So they just haven't hooked it up yet. The submersibles started at Melon Hill and worked their way east, so it took roughly a decade for them to cover the whole oil field and retire all these marvelous old machines. Here we have a drilling rig. This drilling rig, I believe, was drilling CT Kearney well number 27. These are what replaced the old steel derricks that you used to see in the movies. This is a portable derrick. It has an A-frame at the bottom, and it can fold down and then be hooked to two large trucks, one that drives forward and one that drives backward, and driven to the next well hole. It doesn't stay over the well. Okay, what we have here is a replacement where a smaller, older oil pump is replaced by a bigger one. The smaller one is a Lufkin 64 conventional. These were one of the standards that were put on most of the oil wells when the field was first drilled after it stopped flowing naturally. Also, I'd point out they were run by internal combustion, gasoline or propane motors or something like that in those days. Today they're all electric. And they pivoted in the middle. They were called a conventional design. And the counterweights, you can have trouble seeing them here, were big weights attached to the bottom of the arms that pushed the walking beam up and down. On the right is an air balance unit, like I mentioned before. The smaller pump pulled the rod out of the ground about 64 inches and the big air balance about 192 inches. So more than double the stroke length. Each time it went up and down, it sucked that much more oil out of the ground. As the field had been converted in the late 50s to what they called water flood. Oil floats on water, and they found by shutting down some of the oil wells and forcing water down the hole that it would help the remaining producing wells get more of the oil because it lifted it up. As the pressure from the water flood went up, they started putting in more and more of these big pumps and replacing the smaller, earlier 64 models. So they would pull the horse head off the front of the walking beam of the old model and then put the new one right in next to it like this. Here we see one of those great big air balances. In those days they were all painted black. They were all scratched and marred from many years of faithful service. They had big Waukesha internal combustion motors on the back, and I loved them. In fact, I had parked my bicycle, which was my main mode of transportation as a kid, right next to the, pretty close to the wellhead, to give you an idea of the size of this monster. This picture was taken in about 1970. They had just completed this well and put this pump on it. It was 20 years before I got back to Rangeley, but lo and behold, here we have the same well, and it still has an air balance pump on it. Notice the pump has changed color. It is now a sand color because the U.S. government regulations required they be painted to blend in with the scenery. Down below, where my bicycle had been, is a nice rental car. Lufkin was the major manufacturer of most of the pumps in the field in those days, but the number 2 model was made by a company called Bethlehem. This is a Bethlehem 64 pump. They had nice yellow or white walking beams. And notice that the place where the arms connect to the beam is located over the beam instead of under it, like a Lufkin. But it worked on the same principle. These weights were on a crank that went around, and as they went around, they pushed the arms up and down, which pushed that collar, called an equalizer, up and down, which lifted the walking beam, and it pivoted in the middle like a seesaw. Here's a Lufkin 64. This one we called the zebra well, though really it's not the well that was zebra painted, but the pump on it. There were 2 zebra wells. They were near the site of an old airfield once, and still retained their bright orange paint. This is a National 64, same size as the Lufkins. In fact, you can see a Lufkin 64 in the bottom, in the background, just under the National nameplate. It too had revolving counterweights that fit onto that kind of round barrel-like shaped thing. Push the arms up and down, which pushed the walking beam. In those days, almost all the Rangeley pumps worked on internal combustion motors, except in the town itself. So at night, there was always this rumbling in the town as you had those hundreds of oil pump motors all working away, and when you heard them all together on a still night, it was kind of a deep, ominous rumbling. Here's another National. Now on this one, you see they've spread the counterweights out a little bit, but it also had an interesting shaped head. Normally on an oil pump, a rod pump, the head is called the horse's head because it looks a little like a horse's head. But on this one, it looks a little like a horse being led. It's smaller, and it connects to a collar which pulls the pipe out of the ground. We kids used to call these dog heads. This one here was the only national pump dog head in the Rangeley Field that I knew of. This is Mary Heffley number 4. We lived right down the street from her. Most of the oil wells were named for the ones who owned the land when they came in and leased it to drill the oil wells. So there were a lot of oil wells named for surveyors, for Rangeley pioneers, ranchers, sometimes for the oil companies themselves. Whoever Mary Heffley was, she had 4 wells on her lease, and then later they drilled 3 more, so today in Rangeley there's 7 or 8 of them. But Heffley 4 here still has its classic standard oil derrick. This was an immovable tower that was assembled over the well after it was brought in or completed. They needed the tower to stack the pipe in when they would service the well. If something broke down underground, they'd have to pull out the pipe sections till they found the broken one, and the tower gave them a place to stack them, as well as a place. They had something up top called the drawworks, with a big hook called the traveling block, which would go down, grab onto a section of pipe at the wellhead, and then pull it up and stack it in the tower. The invention of folding jackknife towers on trucks pretty much doomed these permanent towers, and by the late 50s they were all gone except in the town itself, where I was able to photograph a few of them before even those disappeared in the 1970s. Here's a close-up of Mary Heffley number 4. You can see the bottom of the derrick tower, the Lufkin 64 pump underneath, and then a lot of them had a little tin shack over the motor that we called engine houses. I don't know what they were for. They disappeared about the same time as the derricks did. In the background, that's Rangeley Junior High School, where I got an education, and one day when I came out of junior high school for lunch, lo and behold, the derrick tower was gone. They'd taken it down in just a couple hours. Here's Lufkin's version of a doghead oil pump. This is a Lufkin 74, roughly, give or take an inch or two. Works on the same principle as a 64, but it's got that funny little compact head and collar that sucks the rod up and out of the ground. This is on Mary Heffley number 5X. An X at the end of the oil well's name and number indicated it had not been drilled with the original field, but was an infill well drilled later, starting in the 1960s. Here we have, I believe this is C.T. Carney number 6X, another new well with a doghead pump on it, a Lufkin. Here's a side picture of old Ironsides, the aforementioned Little Bethlehem pump out behind the Rangeley Hospital, the one that broke a pitman arm and tore itself to pieces one night. This was before that happened, obviously. And in the background, that's a Continental EMSCO pump up on the hill in the background. While Chevron Oil Company had been elected to manage all the oil companies that had invested in the deep field, that's why they called it unitized, private interests ran all the little shallow pumps, and there were quite a few of them. Here we have a pump that's been converted to water flood injection. The horse head has been taken off the pump and it's been stopped. And in those days they sprayed an insulating foam over the wellhead because it was now pumping water into the ground instead of sucking oil out of it. Soon the headless walking beam pump would disappear and be moved to another well, and that would be all that would be left. Another picture of the famous Zebra well we mentioned a minute ago with a Lufkin pump on it. The next well down had a national pump that had been painted the zebra colors. It had been converted to water flood injection. There's the old granddaddy of them all. That is Raven A1, the Discovery well. Raven was drilled in 1933. Because there was no town, no roads, no nothing, and no demand, it was shut in until World War II. When it started producing, it continued to produce until 1983, when it was converted to a water flood injection, and it was shut down for good several years after that. Today, if you go to Rangeley, out in the middle of the field, there is a tourist site, a little memorial site on the site of the Discovery well with a gazebo, a non-operating oil pump, and some information about the oil field. But this is back in the days when it was producing. There's a nice sunset shot. This actually was one of the few deep wells drilled in the shallow field. There we have my brother, who today is a well-established DJ and a very talented adult, who then was a little 7-year-old boy standing in front of another Bethlehem 64 pump, this on Union Pacific Fee number 3. There's another shot of that same location. This is the next lease beyond Mary Heffley. This is the Heffley Cobb Stringer lease, and this is the one surviving well on it. This is number 1 with a Continental EMSCO 64, again with a dog head and collar. These four funny stumps in the ground, you see two of them here around the front of the oil well, they used to hold a derrick tower. There used to be hundreds of derrick towers in Rangeley, stretching out in straight little rows once upon a time. Today they're all gone. Another view of Heffley Cob Stringer number 1. Here's a good side shot of a Bethlehem. This is on another C.T. Carney well. You can clearly see the Bethlehem nameplate. Bethlehem stopped building oil wells somewhere around 1959, give or take a year. Their competitor Lufkin bought their entire stock and continued to produce the Bethlehem name for several years after that. The interesting thing about Bethlehems, beside their yellow color and their streamlined horse head, see how it's nice and rounded, is there are several ways of stacking counterweights, the weights at the back that rotated and offset the great weight of the oil pipe at the other end of the walking beam. Here you see they stack weights kind of like slabs of beef and then bolt them on. Here we have another Bethlehem. This is a different type, where the weights are just, they're kind of triangular and are bolted onto the crank as one piece. This one has just been water injected, and there is the sprayed wellhead. And there is the poor rounded horse head. This one looks like a last poor Yorick of Shakespeare fame, contemplating its own severed head as the well has been converted. Okay, I guess I've gabbed enough. We will just shoot through a few more pictures for you. This is the infamous Well 12 overlooking the town of Rangeley. Kids used to like to come here and kiss at night many years ago, but they don't anymore because this well, it's still producing, but it sometimes leaks gas a little bit, so the kids have found a different place to go and park. Here's a little national with a white walking beam. Here we have a water injection that during a January night burst and started spurting out water, and in the frigid cold Colorado night didn't make it very far before the water froze and turned to ice. Here's another well. This is, I believe, this may be one of the F.V. Larson wells. Overlooking the town of Rangeley. I used to come out of junior high school at night, which is in the background somewhere, and watch the derrick tower all lit up by lights as the Roughnecks round the clock sank this well. Here is the Raven Memorial. There is an inoperative Bethlehem pump on the site and some information about it. Here we have another Bethlehem pump being about to be replaced by a Lufkin air balance. A few more Lufkin air balance pictures here. Here's a modern Lufkin. You see it's painted that sand color. And here we have a modern air balance. They're one of the few left in Rangeley. It's been painted a sand color, but they didn't get all the way to the top of the pump yet. Probably by now it's all sand color. So this gives you a little sample, my friends, of what the Rangeley oil field looked like back in the 1960s and the 1970s. If you go there today, it's still a full production oil field, but like I said, a lot of it has been converted to underground. But back in those days, it was fascinating. And although I have no direct connection to the oil industry, I have never lost, I may have lost my ability to speak coherently, but I've never lost my love for this town and the industry around it out there in the wild and woolly West. Hope you enjoyed this. Have a good day.